Majority Report with Sam Seder.
The destiny of America is always safer in the hands of the people than in the conference rooms of any elite.
Sam Seder.
They are unanimous in their hate for me, and I welcome their hatred.
We must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex.
The Majority Report with Sam Seder.
Ever get the feeling you've been cheated?
It is Thursday, December 27th, 2018. My name is Sam Seder. This is the 5-time award-winning Majority Report. We are broadcasting live to tape. Steps from the industrially ravaged Gowanus Canal in the heartland of America. Downtown Brooklyn, USA. On the program today, it is another one of our famous best of shows. We've done this now 8 years running, where we look back on the year that was. Some of the best interviews, as voted by you, the listener, or you, the guy sitting right there. And today we have for you, from midway through the year, I think it was June 26th perhaps, Dr. Henry Giroux talking about American Nightmare, facing the challenge of fascism. And also, Matt has what we call Matt Picks, clips, some of the funniest moments, interesting moments, heartfelt moments.
Mostly funny.
Mostly funny. Funnily heartfelt moments of the year assembled for you as we make it a freebie Thursday. We're doing the freebies. We don't lock out non-members during the best ofs. Anyways, this year, I think we have in the past. Not sure, but today we just said let's open it all up. So check it out for that. Of course, members will not hear ads. Because when you're a member, you don't hear ads, and members have access to that Brandon Straka thing, which we may post down the line. But for now, if you want to see that debate where I'm shockingly condescending and smug, check it out. In the meantime, what are some of the challenges that small business owners face? For me, the worst thing about doing this job is that I'm running a small business. I don't like, just the logistics involved in it, all the different paperwork. It's difficult. If you're a small owner, honeybook.com can help you spend less time handling the administrative work and more time doing what you love. Oh. Honeybook is an all-in-one business management platform for creative small businesses. Hello? They make it easy to streamline your process with client and calendar management tools and custom branded proposals and contracts. We don't do a lot of contracts here, right? I mean, it's like set and go. But they're just the idea of like calendar management, who's going to be taking off. I mean, just keeping track of how many times Michael decides to take off. You can even get e-signatures, generate invoices, and get paid faster, all within one online system. So if you're a plumber or an electrician or, there's a million different things. Photographer, a designer, graphic artist. There's over 75,000 of folks like you, event professionals, other solo entrepreneurs have saved hundreds, if not thousands of hours with HoneyBook. It's geared towards creatives. I mean, theoretically, I guess you could if you were a plumber, but it's geared towards the type of stuff that you do when you deal with your clients, and you want a sense of you want to express some of the creativity that you also have as you're billing folks. We have partnered with honeybook.com to offer Majority Report listeners 50% off the first year of HoneyBook when you use the promo code MAJORITY. You get a full year at half price. So get started at honeybook.com today. Use promo code MAJORITY for 50% off your first year. You're a graphic artist, photographer. You don't want to deal with the business stuff. Do it all in one place. Makes it easy. Again, that's honeybook.com, promo code MAJORITY. Also, folks, I've told you about Grove. Whether it's cranberry sauce drops or your uncle's smelly socks, nothing cleans holiday messes like Mrs. Meyer's holiday scents. Available in Iowa pine, peppermint, and orange clove. Shop your favorite scents at grove.co. Then, once you place your first order of $20 or more, new customers will get the holiday set, which includes a free Mrs. Meyer's holiday hand soap, a free Mrs. Meyer's holiday dish soap, free Mrs. Meyer's holiday multi-surface spray, Grove Collaborative Red Cleaning Caddy, and Grove Collaborative Walnut Scrubber Sponges. Those are awesome. I've been using those for a while now. If you spend $39, you also receive a free Grove stoneware tray to beautifully display your new holiday soaps. I have to say, I've talked about Grove in the past. I love it. I use a lot of, I'm not a big scented fan. I know a lot of people are, but I get a lot of chemical-free products, a lot of safer soaps and whatnot, a lot of recycled paper, toilet paper, etc. And some of that stuff I don't want to carry home. It's not at the normal supermarket. I don't want to go on Amazon to do that for obvious reasons. Grove is great. They got a great selection. They got great prices, and they send it right to your door. It's grove.co. Shop Grove before this exclusive holiday offer runs out. The stuff will be gone come December. For a limited time, my listeners will get Mrs. Meyer's holiday products, a 60-day VIP membership, and a surprise bonus gift free when you sign up and place an order of $20 or more. Check out Grove and our special offer at grove.co/TMR. That's grove.co/TMR. That's grove.co, not com, .co/TMR. All right, we're going to take a quick break. When we come back, my interview with Dr. Henry Giroux on the American Nightmare, facing the challenge of fascism. We are back. Sam Seder on the Majority Report. It is a pleasure to welcome back to the program professor at McMaster University, author of many books, and his most recent, American Nightmare, Facing the Challenge of Fascism. Henry Giroux, welcome back to the program.
Sam, it's always a delight to be on the program with you.
Okay, so let's start with some definitions so that we know what we're talking about. Fascism, we hear it quite a bit. What does it mean? Both, I guess, in a sort of a historical context, but my sense is that the term is a lot less. I mean, I feel like sometimes it gets very narrowly defined, and that makes it sort of like historically unique, when in fact it's a dynamic in some ways.
No, right. I mean, I think that in many ways there are two ways to understand this. I mean, one definition is just as you've suggested, enormously static, in that it seems to suggest that it was a period that we can refer to in the 1920s and the 1930s, particularly around places like Italy and Nazi Germany, and eventually even later in Argentina, in some of the countries in Latin America, in which it seems to me that it seemed to include a belief in the supremacy of one national ethnic group over another, and a kind of deep-seated contempt for democracy, and an insistence on an obedience to a powerful leader and a strong demagogic approach. I mean, I think that that's some of the basic elements of a kind of static fascism, but I think that what I've tried to say in this book regarding the use of that term is that it's not static, and that those very elements, whether we're talking about ultranationalism, we're talking about white supremacy, we're talking about a politics of disposability, the notion that a country is in decline, the elevation of emotion over intellectualism, the contempt for dissent, and the rule of law. I mean, these things tend to emerge in different forms. And while one can say, and I certainly have said, that the United States does not mirror in some static way, when I talk about fascism, what we saw in Germany, it does contain elements of a kind of fascism that get reproduced in the American flag and get reproduced in a range of issues that basically are endemic to the culture, the American society and culture, as we're currently seeing it unfolding, especially under the Trump administration.
Are there a set of circumstances? Is there a means in which to measure? Is it when we can say, "Oh, we're living in a fascist society"? Is it something where definitionally we can be?
No, I think that's a great question. I mean, I think there are two ways to answer that question. I think that one is to look at fascism always starts with a language, and it's generally a language of brutality. It's a language of dehumanization. It's a language that legitimates hatred and racism and violence. It attacks the truth. It undermines the possibility of a free press. It refuses to allow the press to hold power accountable, and it often claims that the rule of law can only operate when it serves actually the concentration of power. And I think at one level, when we look at the language of fascism, even in its most brutal forms, one can argue that language has reappeared, particularly under the Trump administration, in a way to provide a very dire warning about where this government is moving. Secondly, I think we look at policies. And I think that what we have seen emerging in the last 40 years in the United States is a kind of casino capitalism that so accentuates both the enormous inequities in wealth and power, massive amounts of inequality, in ways in which 40 million people are living in poverty in the United States, and 12 million people are living in extreme poverty. And I think that what these conditions often do is they generate what I would call fascist instincts. They mobilize certain kinds of fascist principles, the hatred of the other, the blaming of Muslims, the appeal to racial purity, the extreme nationalism. All these things find an avenue in a kind of resentment that's seething among people who feel relatively powerless. And then, of course, you begin to see policies that are addressed to and bait that group, whether we're talking about the separation of children from their parents at the border, whether we're talking about the hatred of Muslims and laws that seem to suggest that, whether we're talking about a constant accentuation on the part of the Trump administration for a law and order regime that basically refuses to deal with questions of law and order in a legitimate way. Remember, there's a kind of thuggery in Trump's language that even police chiefs have attempted to repudiate. When he says, when you arrest somebody, don't just push their head down, bang their head into the car.
Right.
My God. I mean, this is a guy who actually has become a kind of classic example of how the mobilizing passions of fascism are really being fed by both his policies and his language.
I mean, that's the thing is that, it seems like, and I want to sort of walk through some of the elements of your book, but I mean, while we're here, there's, certainly we can point to, right, Trump's language, like you say, or the specific policy of separating children from their parents. But in totality, this is the thing, is like, how do you know that that fascism has taken hold in real time, right? It's an interesting question, because if you read the historians of fascism, what they often say is that this emergence of fascism in Nazi Germany, and actually in Italy as well, were actually incremental. People went about their daily lives being indifferent to all of a sudden policies that were both cruel, inhumane, and extremely dangerous in terms of what they were suggesting. And I think that, one could say, well, what's the end point
to recognize that you're in a fascist state? Well, the endpoint would be when you lose any basic freedoms that suggest that a democracy matters. Or the endpoint might be those basic institutions that make a democracy possible all of a sudden no longer are there. And I think that what we can say, rather than going to that endpoint and saying, well, we're not really a fascist country until we're there, right. I think that what we really have to say is, look, to what degree are we in the abyss? I mean, to what degree are we moving forward in a way that suggests that endpoint is possible? Look, Sam, when you get a person like Madeleine Albright, I mean, not exactly on the left, right? Writing a book claiming, we're basically becoming a fascist state. When you get the head of the NSA, Michael Hayden, saying that we're moving towards fascism, I mean, when you get all these conservatives who are now saying, hey, look, we've reached a point that's very dangerous here, and we need to be attuned to it by looking at history so that we can begin to understand that what we have seen in the past echoes something that we're seeing in the present that should become a kind of warning, to say the very least, as to where the country is going. It makes no sense to say we're not a fascist country until we have concentration camps. The question that really has to be asked is, what are the conditions that produce those camps? I mean, I think that's the basic issue.
And is there are there accelerants? I mean, or is it? I mean, is there the more that one? I mean, because look, I mean, by in a vacuum, if I was to look at what's going on with these so-called tent camps for these children who are immigrants, I could say these are concentration camps. I mean, not every concentration camp was established as a death camp,
right.
during, they were literally to concentrate undesirables so that ultimately, if speaking as a German in late 30s, if we come up with a solution for how we deal with these undesirables, we'll have them conveniently located. Ultimately, there was a final solution in that
right.
instance. So, I mean, it's when you start to see, I wonder if the lack of reaction, or if there is a reaction to when you start to see these early signs where it may be fascism, it may not be fascism, if the reactions in any way function as an accelerant or a de-accelerant.
I think there are two kinds of reactions. I mean, I think that there's often a reaction that's fed by demagogues that actually accelerates and intensifies the emergence of a fascist state. And I think that that's one of the things that we're actually seeing with Trump. At another level, of course, there's a progressive populist reaction, and we're also seeing that in some way is beginning to recognize how dangerous the climate has become. Whether we're talking about whether we're talking about the DACA situation, whether we're talking about young students coming out of schools protesting mass violence, whether we're talking the Black Lives Matter movement and the assault on police violence, or whether we're talking about the increasing concerns that many groups are mobilizing over concerning the ecological crisis. But I think that the real issue here is at what point do these groups actually come together and begin to recognize that outside of the political silos that they operate in, there's really a larger threat, and that threat is to democracy itself. And I think that what we need to look at is to ask ourselves, what are the institutions and what are the formative cultures that make a democracy possible? You don't have an informed citizenry, you don't have a democracy. And I think that all we have to do is look at the attack on public education, the attack on higher education, the attack on the press, the attack on the rule of law, the increasing attack in many ways on any element of dissent. When a guy like Trump stands up and says, "Boy, I really like the Kim Jong-un because he makes his people stand up," and that's what I want my people to do, stand up. Then he says it's just a joke, but it's not a joke for him. We know what that means. We know that he confuses loyalty with basically any kind of moral and social sense of responsibility, and I think that in that way, there are indicators in terms of what you're talking about. But I'll go back to something that you've talked about. You say tent city. Remember, the United States has as the social state is eliminated, as the welfare state is eliminated, what takes its place is the punishing state. And if you ask me how I can prove that, all you have to do is ask yourself, talk about two things. You have to talk about the increasing number of people who are considered disposable and throwaways in the United States, and you increasingly can look at the accentuation of what I call the criminalization of a whole range of behaviors. It's a criminal act to be poor today. It's a criminal act to be in schools and to all of a sudden violate a dress code. I mean, the prison is increasingly becoming the model for a whole range of institutions, from social services to the schools to the airports. And I think we need to be very attentive to the way in which violence becomes the only organizing principle left to really solve a whole range of social problems. And that is absolutely endemic to the issue of fascism to me.
And so is the idea that these circumstances make us more vulnerable to a Donald Trump, that we're walking around with like a low, immune system essentially, and we can function like that as long as we don't catch this, we don't bump into this virus on some level?
Well, as long as they don't come for us, right? I mean, look, you've got a civic culture that's been eradicated under neoliberalism, under this extreme form of capitalism. We've lost our shared sense of citizenship. A private right is more important than the common good. I mean, we live in a culture of self-absorption. We live in a culture of immediacy, and I guess what I'm getting at, we live in a culture controlled largely by a corporate media. And we have a Republican Party that basically is a bunch of Vichy Republicans. And we don't have a mass uprising against this form of fascism. And I think, as you're suggesting, if I'm reading you carefully enough, that this is dangerous. I mean, this is really dangerous. I mean, how much further will we let this guy go? I mean, separating children from their mothers, sending their parents back to these Latin American countries where there's rampant crime and violence, and the parents don't even know where the children are. I mean, does it get worse than that outside of camps? The images of these young children in these cages? I mean, look, if you want to measure the index of a democracy in any country, look at the way that country treats its children. And by that measure, the United States, it seems to me, is well on the way to a kind of fascism that is as disgusting and revolting as it is dangerous.
Let's talk about the use of language in this era. I mean, Trump has been president for less than 2 years, maybe a year and a half or so, and yet his ability to dominate the media, to dominate almost every single story now in the news, is a function of him in some fashion. We are sitting here just in this, this past week in the wake of the initial reports about this change in policy that happened in April and the implications of that with the children in the in these camps. We have various administration officials. It runs the gamut from denying this is a policy to saying we're doing this because we wanted to intimidate people. Where are we in terms of language, and what has set the table for this?
We're trapped in a language basically dominated by two parties that are basically wedded to a financial elite. And I think that language has nothing to do with democracy and has everything to do with basically the concentration of power in relatively few hands. And believe me, that's not a conspiracy theory. I mean, I think that when 400 families own half of the wealth in the United States, you have to ask yourself, what's happened to politics? When all of a sudden the political state becomes a corporate state, people benefit from this. I mean, people benefit from these concentrations of power. Do you think that the people who are backing Trump in any way want to endanger the possibility that he's going to pass further policies like his tax cuts that are going to be enormously beneficial to the rich? Absolutely not. I mean, they'll sacrifice the lives of children on the basis of those potential gains. They've already done it with gun laws. They know that guns kill people. They know that. They know that, if you don't have a gun, it's very difficult to shoot somebody from a car or to walk into a school. They know all this. But there are other interests at work here that we rarely make the connections to. And that is when you have a country that's so vastly undemocratic in terms of its concentrations of wealth and power, it's really difficult, it seems to me, to be able to mobilize the kind of language that we need to be able to say, for instance, capitalism and democracy may not be the same thing. They may be at odds with each other at this point in history. We may be evolving into a form of capitalism so ruthless, so overly narcissistic and self-absorbed, so willing to sacrifice human needs to human profits, that maybe it's time to rethink the language of democracy. Maybe it's time to rethink the language of two parties and to begin to talk about a democratic socialist party. Maybe it's time in some way to talk about what social hope means, what social provisions mean, what are the conditions for real agency. Why is it you have one of the richest countries in the world, and of course Philip Alston from the United Nations just did a major study saying we have among the Western nations the worst healthcare system in the world. This is the only country in the world that has not ratified the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights for Children. Can you imagine? The only country in the world, not just the West, the world. I mean, these are interesting issues, but I think that underlying another question that you've raised is we have to stop talking about authoritarianism and totalitarianism simply in terms of economic structures. We have to ask ourselves, what are the formative cultures that make this possible? How is that possible? How do the cultural apparatuses function as teaching machines that shut down and so limit the language and its meaning that people can't make a distinction between the truth and falsifications anymore? I mean, what happened to schools? What happened to higher education? What happened to a media that's like this radio station, that's really willing to ask hard questions? I mean, I watch NBC, CBS, and the major news programs, TV news programs every night. They are so shallow compared to the BBC. I mean, it's like we have one position and we have another. It's a system that trades off false equivalencies. They can't take a position that matters. Even in the face of Trump's white supremacy regarding Charlottesville, they report it as if being objective is a way to somehow get at the truth. I'm sorry. There are some truths that need to be named.
All right. So if it is the case that, we can look to these institutions and these failure of these institutions, whether it's the media, whether it's our education system, in terms of teaching any type of civic literacy, what is done at that point, right? If we have a situation where we have both parties on some level are compromised. Clearly it is in the best interest of the Democratic Party to be at odds with Donald Trump. The Democratic Party, I don't think, could have turned out and elected a leader who would be separating families at the border. But we also are aware that, Barack Obama had some record years of record deportations and arrests. So certainly the table was set for some of this. But what then becomes, and maybe we're getting ahead of ourselves, but let's go for it anyways. What becomes the sort of the tangible steps forward? I'm aware that the education system has failed in terms of creating a citizenry. I am aware that our the language and the structure of our world now has been taken over by neoliberalism, and it devalues things like the commons and like citizenship over sort of marketing and sort of financial competition. But what do I do at that point with that?
I think there are a couple of things. Let's look at the landscape and be able to recognize two things. Power isn't only about domination. It's also about resistance. And I think that we are seeing movements all over the country that are basically, whether we're talking about these women in the red states who are really fighting around the electoral process to put progressives in power. That's a good step. I think there are a lot of people who are operating at the local level to try to address some issues that they find horrendous, whether it be around the question of taxes, the defunding of public schools. So we see all that at the local level, and that's a beginning to, it seems to me, be able to educate people about issues that matter. It's not enough to do like Robert De Niro does, to call Trump a jerk. That doesn't quite work. I mean, I think that what we really need to do is to say, okay, what kind of policies matter here? Do you need health care? How do we talk about that? What does it mean when a president who claims he's a populist passes a tax law that's basically utterly regressive and most of the benefits go to the financial elite? Let's talk about that. I mean, people need to begin to create a narrative that speaks to people's needs in ways in which they can recognize themselves. I mean, we need a new story about what America is. We need a new story about what politics might become. And that's an educative task. And I think that to the degree to which we recognize that education is central to politics, we can begin to take that seriously, whether through alternative media, working with one foot in mainstream media, struggling over schools, and struggling over those cultural apparatuses that basically promote this. I mean, I'm not unoptimistic. I mean, I think the contradictions are so overwhelming right now that people are looking for alternative languages. I mean, I give a talk and 500 people show up if I put the term fascism in the talk. Right. I mean, people are hungry for a language, for social movements, for something they can put their hands on that give them a sense that they don't have to be written out of the script of democracy. I mean, we are certainly seeing that with young people. I mean, young people have finally recognized that they've been so written out of the script that they can't even go to school without actually believing that the police are more important than their teachers.
Right.
And
let me touch on that for a moment, because I want to talk about your concept of the politics of disposability. But let's talk a little bit about the young people for a moment. To what extent? I mean, and I don't want to get too reductive here, but to what extent does the size of generations and the sort of the experience of the baby boomers continues to weigh on us? I can't help but think that we had our last election was between two baby boomers. We have a Democratic leadership that is completely dominated by baby boomers, right? Chuck Schumer and Nancy Pelosi. And there's this, and even Bernie Sanders, but we're sort of like floundering around for the next generation of leaders. Yet the generation just one younger than me, these millennials, and perhaps just slightly older, they don't seem to be, their experience has been so different and not defined by the generations before them. And they seem to be the most. Well, it gives me the most hope. Let me put it that way. So give me your sense of to what extent these generational differences mean anything.
Well, I mean, I think they mean a great deal, certainly in terms of the way culture and society has changed in light of the forces that shape those generations, right? I mean, this generation has grown up under they've grown up under the star of Reagan. This is a generation that has completely grown up under the forces of neoliberalism, under the notion that there's no alternative. As Margaret Thatcher once said, right? Under the notion that government really is more your enemy than your friend. Right. And I think that at the same time they've grown up in a culture in which the question of power, politics, culture, and everyday life has taken on a distinctiveness with a new technology that offers them an opportunity not just to play games, but to actually communicate with each other and use that technology in ways to enlighten themselves, so that they not only have a limited sort of experience of what the world is about, but have access to a broader understanding of that experience. Unlike many theorists, I think that's a good thing. I mean, I think that what we're now seeing with this generation is a generation that's far more cosmopolitan than I think the baby boomers were.
Right.
I mean, the baby boomers were driven by the assumption that, life is open, right? There's a sense of social mobility. You can go to college, you can get a degree, you can buy a house. This generation has grown up under a very different assumption, and that is you're lucky if you're able to survive. You're going to have 15 bosses in your lifetime. It's not about getting ahead. It's about surviving. Democracy is not really working for you, and your life will be much worse than what your parents had. And I think that given those sets of assumptions, this generation is now fighting back and saying, sorry, we're not buying that script. You created that script for us, and it's wrong. and it's at odds with what democracy means. It's at odds with the sense of possibility means. And so we increasingly see a generation that has moved away from a privatized sense of hope to a social sense of hope, meaning that they believe that problems are not just individual, that that all problems can be put at the footsteps of individuals, so as to claim that if there's a problem, you ultimately are the only one responsible for it. They realize that they can translate private issues into systemic problems. That's the great difference with this generation. And it seems to me that's really grounds for hope.
Let's talk about the culture of cruelty in Trump's America. What do you mean by that term?
I mean, the culture of cruelty is a culture that basically disdains human needs and human rights, and has no problem elevating questions of power over questions of human needs. And it's become so expansive within the last 40 years. Because it seems to me that the more that you economize every aspect of social life, the more that you believe that the market basically has the ability to solve all problems and to control not only the economy, but again, the entirety of social life. It becomes a template for all social relations. Morality begins to disappear. Questions of social responsibility begin to disappear. Remember, at the essence of neoliberalism is the notion that economic activity has nothing to do with social cost. And I think to the degree to which we write out questions of ethics, questions of social responsibility, questions of justice, all of a sudden you create a culture that disdains weakness, that refuses compassion, that is more than willing to actually humiliate people who are vulnerable, and is more than willing to take away all those social provisions that would be applied to people in a way that would give them an opportunity to live a decent and just life. All you have to do is look at the language, that has emerged among these extremists in the last 40 years. People being bums, poor people being stupid, people who exercise any kind of compassion being weak. The language of the culture of cruelty is the language of reality TV, right? There's only one person left on the island. It's the language of a war of all against all. It's the language of absolutely rigid, stupid, it seems to me, poisonous forms of competition. It's a language so rooted in self-interest that it's lost the possibility for imagining that any society has to be social and not just an aggregate of self-interested individuals. And that creates a culture that is indifferent to human suffering and lacks compassion, if not disdains it. And the consequences of that are truly deadly and toxic for many people.
Tell me what you mean by the politics of disposability. How is that related to that concept?
Well, I think that when you live in a culture that throws away everything, particularly goods, the politics of disposability in the last 40 years takes on a particular kind of resonance and relevance in that more and more people are now considered disposable. More and more people are now being left out of the American dream. More and more people are now being seen as a threat to a particular kind of notion of racial purity. More and more people all of a sudden are outside the bubble of inclusion on the grounds of a kind of poisonous ultranationalism or a toxic racism. And so what I've argued is that increasingly, whether you're talking about a war on youth, whether you're talking about a war on poor blacks, whether you're talking about a war on brown people, undocumented immigrants, the scope and the level and the degree and the range of disposability of those who are considered excess has so expanded that it's now become a defining feature, I would argue, of American politics.
Let's talk a little bit about this concept of democracy in exile and toward a politics of ungovernability. What discuss those two concepts for me and where that leads us.
What I've argued about the notion of democracy in exile suggests that there are all kinds of institutions and social relations developing throughout the United States in which people keep the idea of democracy alive, whether it's about shared goods, whether it's about trading it off with each other, whether it's about the rise of the sanctuary movement, whether it's about new attempts at thinking what communities actually are, whether it's about, creating health services that are not based on simply profit, whether it's about bringing people together in public spheres in which they produce their own newspapers, they produce their own media. I mean, these are alternative spheres that become a model for what democracy should look like. And I think we're seeing them sprout up, particularly among young people, all over the place. I mean, they're not governed by the logic of greed and rabid individualism and a kind of war of all against all. They're places where people are trying to resurrect a sense of shared citizenship, a sense of public service, a kind of passionate notion of compassion. And I think that unless those things become visible, or let me put it differently, when they do become visible and as they begin to emerge, they offer an antidote to a kind of toxic capitalism that basically believes that there should be no social provisions, there should be no social goods, that the commons doesn't matter, and it's okay to wage war on the planet in ways that would eventually destroy it, and to elevate the question of militarism over the question of justice.
So, I mean, just to sort of to bring this home, the act of resistance, in a practical sense, how does it stem the tide of fascism? I mean, is it something that needs to have depth or breadth or both?
It has to have both. It has to have both. It basically has to be insightful in terms of the forces that are now threatening democracy. And at the same time, it has to expand into social movements, into what I would call a mass political formation capable of challenging these two existing parties. We cannot allow the Democrats to basically be the party of resistance. They are not the party of resistance. They're the party of the financial elite. They're the soft version. The Republicans are the hard version. And it seems to me that not only do we need to have what I would call 1 foot in and 1 foot out when it comes to resistance, meaning that I think all the major institutions that govern American life should be seen as sites of struggle, and we should do everything we can to change them. But at the same time, I think we also have to operate outside of an electoral process that seems to suggest that if you vote, you've somehow maxed out your capacity for being for democratic participation. I mean, we need to learn. We need to remember what Martin Luther King did, what Gandhi did. These are people who believed in direct action. I mean, these are people who stood in the streets, who put their bodies on the line. These are people who said, sorry, we're not going to wait for an election to be able to liberate young children who are being ripped from their mother's arms and put in basically what appear to be concentration camps. I mean, it doesn't work that way. And I think that in many ways, people have been too comfortable with the notion of democracy that they think works well, when in fact it's been consistently eroded, in full view.
So, I mean, to be clear, you're not saying. I mean, you're saying participate in elections and make choices that are somewhat expedient there, but do not do that at the expense or as some type of substitute for far greater involvement in direct action. And
no, absolutely, Sam. Sam, what I'm saying is, unlike many people, I'm not saying it's reform or a radical restructuring of society. I'm saying it's both. I'm saying reforms are limited, but in the most immediate sense, they may save people's lives, right? I mean, I'm sorry. If I have the opportunity to change power relations, which make sure that people are not making a choice between eating and taking their drugs, I'm going to make it. I don't believe in that kind of political purity where you say, no, that's reformism. I'm sorry. That's nonsense to me. I mean, I think that we need to do everything we can to eliminate the suffering that people are engaged in. At the same time, we need to change systemically the structure that produces it. And reforms will not do that.
I see. It's a little bit of walking and chewing gum at the same time, I guess.
No, it's a matter of being able to think in dialectical terms, to put it that way. I mean, right? I mean, it's a matter of knowing what you can do in the most immediate sense, but also recognizing in the long term, it's a long march through the institutions. These institutions have to change. and especially with the war on the planet. I mean, I don't know how much time we have.
Right.
The clock is ticking. That atomic clock is now what? 1 minute before doomsday or 30 seconds? I mean, people have to wake up. You have to wake up and realize that these are dangerous times. These are crucial times. Resistance is no longer an option. It's an absolute necessity.
Henry Giroux, the book is American Nightmare, Facing the Challenge of Fascism. Thank you so much for your time today. I really appreciate it.
You bet, Sam. Thanks for having me on.
Okay. Look, where to begin? I'm just going to say, part of the reason that Sam Harris has always bothered me so much is that if you look at the pattern, this is going back several years when I always had a problem with, and now it's become a lot more stark, because when you get into race, quote unquote, science, this is a much, that hits most Americans a little bit more viscerally. But all of the anti-Muslim shit and all of the thought experiments about, dropping a nuclear weapon on the Muslim world and all of this nonsense, the same pattern of policy illiterate, aggressive, ahistorical approach and a reactionary bent, which when he is cornered, he retreats to usually either bizarre obsessive self-defense or just stating truisms. And I think this debate with Ezra Klein revealed a lot about Sam Harris. And we'll start, and this is also, it's inescapable because you can't not talk at this point about this guy's psycho-emotional issues. I'm not going to do an amateur diagnosis, and I'm not trying to take a cheap shot here. But if you listen to this show with Ezra Klein, and you can hear it as anything other than a sort of controlled outburst and 2-hour act of projection and hysteria, I don't know what else you're listening to. Let's just run through some of the sound clips from this exchange with Ezra Klein.
I think there is what you would call confusion here. I do think it's just important to say this. I have not criticized you, and I continue to not, for having the conversation. I've criticized you for having the conversation without dealing with and separating it out and thinking through the context and the weight of American history on it, not the weight of American history.
The weight of American history is completely irrelevant to...
No, it can't possibly be irrelevant on something that even you admit is environmental.
The only thing that is relevant... So, yes, but that part of the conversation has been had. You don't have to talk about slavery. You don't have to talk about the specific injustices in the past to have a conversation about the environmental factors that very likely keep people back.
So, okay, here what's really interesting, and the reason that we wanted to isolate this is, first of all, that's actually the most honest distillation of Sam Harris's philosophy. And I'm sure that people are going to say it's taken out of context or whatever, but to the extent that we have human context, and you hear that bracketed in how he intervened there. So Sam didn't say, I would be completely fucking delusional to say, and then we clipped it out. Okay? You heard how he said that and then the context in it. So, ironically, the guy is a total idealist and not an empiricist. He literally thinks, and you see this with religion, that abstractions and ideas exist almost in a Platonic form outside of history. During most of the conversation, he's on one hand saying that Charles Murray, who's an incredibly well-compensated and profoundly influential policy entrepreneur, who's written multiple best-selling books, who's won prizes, who's appeared in almost every major news outlet in the country, whose books are reviewed endless times in the New York Times. He's been on everything from ABC News to Bill Maher, that this guy is oppressed because some kids protested him, okay? While not doing that, he's then also basically saying, like, I don't agree necessarily with Murray's policy prescriptions, even though the whole point of Murray's work is his policy prescriptions. It's been quite influential. And if you look at the bell curve, he actually literally talks about the policy disincentives that need to be created from having, quote unquote, stupid mothers having children because of this genetic determinism. At the same time, while begging from Murray, he actually echoes Murray's core argument there, which is that even by the 1970s, when Charles Murray first came on the scene, he was saying that race and IQ could be completely disconnected from environment because Jim Crow and legal segregation was over, which in Murray's case fits with his far-right politics, and I would say, yes, indeed, racism. In Harris's case, Harris is so delusional and disconnected from any broader understanding of how the world works that, yes, in his personal normative sense, he's not a racist, but he becomes an active agent of racism through this attitude. What's the next clip we have?
This is where they talk about the Flynn, what Flynn told Ezra.
Well, this is interesting because you'll hear in this exchange, it's kind of unbelievable, but I just want to stipulate in the interest of intellectual fairness that in the past, Sam has said that apparently like race and IQ, although he does seem to now have a big interest in this, although he's not particularly interested in the field, he doesn't include he doesn't rule out the possibility that there are things like psychic phenomenon. So it is possible that even though Ezra Klein is quoting James Flynn, and even though James Flynn is confirming what Ezra is saying, that Sam Harris actually has a karmic a psychic connection to James Flynn, which he's developed through meditation, which allows him to understand that what Ezra is saying about what James Flynn said to Ezra on the phone is wrong. Let's check this out.
You say that it is unfair journalistically to put your conversation within the lineage of the conversation going all the way back in American history and all the way, as you say, pre-American history. In fact, in my piece, I quote Voltaire and Hume and others. That at each point, European descended white men of scientific mind looked around them, looked at the society they saw, looked at the outcomes people had in the society they saw, looked at the science pulled from those outcomes, right? And it was called science back then too. And said, you know what? What we are seeing here is a result of innate differences between the races. And but something I'm just going to say, we've not even talked through questions of like what it even means to talk about races and the way that has changed over time, but I'll just bracket that. And at each point, that has been, it's been justified in different ways with different kinds of science. But, now we look back and we say, oh man, they did not know what they were talking about. That was ridiculous. I mean, look at what was going on in their society. But they, they looked and they ran their studies and they ran the numbers and they said, there's just a difference here. There's a difference here. And that is why things are turning out the way they are.
But Ezra, I'm pointing out that the bias...
Tell me why it is unfair to put your conversation in that lineage, why the burden of proof is not actually on you to say, here's why it is different this time. Here is why we are at a point either in American history or science or whatever, where that is no longer, like, we are certain that nobody in 50 years is going to look back at us and say that. Because scientifically, what the scientists who are on my side of this argument think, and they include James Flynn and many others, they say that's where we are here. I just quoted him to you.
It was still a misleading summary of what he said. I know what he's on record saying here, and you're interpreting it in a way that you like. I understand that, but
no, I'm not interpreting. James Flynn just said to me 2 days ago that it is consistent with the evidence that there is a genetic advantage or disadvantage for African Americans. That it is entirely possible that the 10-point IQ difference we see reflects a 12-point environmental difference and a -2 genetic difference.
Sure. Many things are possible, right? We're trying to judge on what is plausible to say, and more important, I am worried about the social penalty for talking about these things, because again, it will come back to us on things that we don't expect, like the Neanderthal thing, right? Like that comes out of left field. Had it gone another way, all of a sudden we can't talk about Neanderthal DNA anymore, and it would be there's no point in having our politics be hostage to these kind of tripwire effects, where you say something that seems politically invidious, merely talking about the data as they are. I mean, unless every population of human beings has exactly the same mean and the same variance for every trait we care about, we are guaranteed to be blindsided by these differences that seem important to people who care about differences among groups.
Okay, so first, there's one valuable thing that came out of this, which is the new sound drop. Now we can't talk about Neanderthals anymore, which we'll be using liberally. But okay, so first there's the possibility, and Sam hasn't commented on this, that I meditate as well. No one has shaken my faith in the power of meditation more than Sam Harris. But in my experience of meditating, I have not been able yet to connect psychically. If Sam psychically is connected with James Flynn, that he could read that what he said to Ezra Klein on the phone was wrong, he should immediately publicly release those emails. But beyond that, I mean, Jesus Christ, there's there's a real mess that Sam has created. It's pretty invidious for me to have to clean it up. But the first part that Ezra's making, if you didn't catch, is he's actually saying that what Flynn told him and what is possible is that this 10-point IQ gap might actually be a 12% environmental influence, which means that there's a 2% lead for black people in IQ over white people, which, speaking of innate biases, Sam Harris dismissed this hypothetical in a field that he admits does not have settled science on as basically just ridiculous. Should we hear that again? So let's just listen to that again. It is very revealing.
Still a misleading summary of what he said. I know what he's on record saying here, and you're interpreting it in a way that you like. I understand that, but
no, I'm not interpreting. James Flynn just said to me 2 days ago that it is consistent with the evidence that there is a genetic advantage or disadvantage for African Americans. That it is entirely possible that the 10-point IQ difference we see reflects a 12-point environmental difference and a -2 genetic difference.
Sure. Many things are possible, right? We're trying to judge on what is plausible to say, and more important, I am worried about the social penalty for talking about these things because.
Okay, so let me also just say, I would say that I think it's actually, and this, by the way, is already stipulating a path that we've gone down here, which we need to have. We're going to have Eric Turkheimer on this show to talk about the science and debunk it from that perspective. But we need to get back to have a much more rigorous conversation about a test that, of course, is understood to be universally valid by the people that study it and administrate it. That's hardly a shock that they would say that, and is a privately owned test by a private testing industry that already exerts far too much influence in American and international life and tracks not just on race, but all sorts of other class disparities in our system. Tabling that much more important conversation, and even someone like Siddhartha Mukherjee's book on genes actually addresses this very well. We'll come back to that later. But Sam is just saying, it's ridiculous. And now my question would be, if we're stipulating that this is such sound science, and a lot of it is genetic, it actually seems to me that it might be possible that if you subjected one population to everything from slavery to mass murder to terrorism to systemic political, economic, job, and employment discrimination legally through at least the 60s, and then continued with social stigmas, cultural stories, which, by the way, Harris and Murray are doing their best to reinforce, to, again, housing, job, discrimination, police interactions, police violence, not to mention lead, other environmental pollutants, which have actually been shown empirically to lower IQ scores, including even down to telling kids to not eat fish because the mercury actually can lower their score as well. It actually strikes me that only a 10-point differential might be just the sort of methodologically interesting question to ask. If the gap is that small, maybe we're talking about just a community that just starts with an innately higher intellectual advantage. I mean, this is, and by the way, that type of subjective musing and speculation about the data is social science. This isn't math. You're always framing data questions. You're always framing studies. Human bias and subjectivity is never impossible to escape, let alone when you're talking about research that exists in the context of the entirety of American history. And then Sam goes back to his real bailiwick, which is, of course, the real aggrieved parties, in a conversation that goes back to the founding crime of America is obviously him and Charles Murray. No one has been more hurt. What's the next? Do we have more?
No, that's it. But just to be explicit, because I think there's a certain sort of Sam Harris fan that could watch this segment and think, well, they're still not addressing that. Ezra wanted to talk about all these history things, and Sam Harris just wanted to talk about the data as it is.
Right.
The important thing is that the data as it is doesn't even say that either. There is nothing in the data that suggests that there's a permanent racial IQ gap, which is what Charles Murray's been going on for 20 years about. And so
Longer.
Yeah, exactly. So it's absurd that
Charles Murray burned a cross when he was a teenager. part of his research comes from the Pioneer Foundation, which was a eugenicist group and involved research from people who literally did study things like penis size versus brain size, like actually, not as a joke. He used this research along with other pseudoscientific theories, and I will say pseudoscientific, to forward reactionary social policies, which not only have not marginalized him, they are our policies. We do have disastrously small spending on welfare and social advancement and social justice. And now we also have the type of immigration policies, which is paid attention to less, but he also called for in the bell curve along with Herrnstein. There's nothing in the science, if we even accept the science, that says that this is permanent and irreversible.
Yeah, if we grant the way that he conceives of race and IQ, it's bullshit still. And that's why he talks about Neanderthals, because the current data, Neanderthals in an alternate reality, where it turns out that it's not like Europeans that have some Neanderthal DNA, it's Africans. He suggests that in that hypothetical reality, we would have a PC outrage that maybe he'd have to self-immolate his career over.
Yeah,
but instead he's jumping the gun on that, like, because he's fundamentally not.
Because he's a lunatic. And by the way, if that came out, no one would care. We wouldn't be sitting here in our studio like, oh my God, what are we going to do about the Neanderthal story that was created, that was written up in the back page of the science section of the New York Times, and maybe a handful of white supremacists ran with, and a handful of people on Twitter were offended by. No one gives a fuck. People do give a fuck about the attempt to naturalize racism so as to implement social Darwinism in policy, which the whole time he's saying he disagrees with. You know, at least Charles Murray is coherent in his despicable contributions to human life. I mean, Sam Harris would be a lot more likable, though no less despicable, if he was the reverse, if he was genuinely scientifically sound and a white supremacist. Like if he was just like, the data just doesn't, imagine he's like with Richard Spencer, and he's just like, Richard, I would love to live in a society where I never had to listen to rap music or see basketball again. Okay, that is my normative preference. But if you look at what Nisbet is saying about IQ, the data isn't there. This doesn't account for the Flynn effect. We need to be prepared for the worst case scenario. Okay, let's say disaster. IQ, it's been mapped. And black people are not only athletically superior, they're also intellectually and morally superior. Okay, they're better at solving math problems. What then? Does that mean our commitment to a white ethno-state is any less valid? Of course not. We need to be prepared for these contingencies. That's the more full, honest Sam Harris I would like to see.
All of a sudden, we can't talk about Neanderthal DNA anymore. Am I inferior to John von Neumann?
Yes.
I don't think so, and I don't think you think so.
I do. That was
scientific
Ezra.
Data can't be racist.
The other fun thing about...
I got to remind myself that his cultists are so into people remaining calm at all times. Let me tap into my breathing. Scientific facts can't be racist. The deeper implication of this worldview is a war on every single human discipline besides a incredibly narrow quantitative idealism that never takes anything systemic or structural into account. And I have to say, even if you were cool with the dumbing down of the Islam stuff, which we'll get to in a second, and even if the race science stuff, for God's sake, doesn't bother you and disturb you and outrage you intellectually and morally, there's a reason why Silicon Valley robots are interested in this type of thinking. This is the enabling of an algorithm-driven age with zero concern for any type of provision of public good and accounting for anything besides goals set within its own narrow limits. And really what's astonishing about Harris is, by all accounts, he is the one. He truly does not understand this. He is totally, he's sincere in all of his whiny bitchitude. He has no clue what he's doing.
He didn't blink when Ezra Klein brought up the point where Charles Murray, I can't remember in which book, is it Coming Apart, or
you mean
losing
human
ground.
accomplishment?
Where Murray measured human accomplishment by how many column inches black people versus white people got in the Encyclopedia Britannica.
Right. So you have right. You literally have a guy who actually subconsciously, or for whatever reason, gave us all the great favor of being like, lest you were deceived with my intimidating seeming book, which was in fact a racist tract of discredited science analysis and social Darwinism. Here's this book, which is like the intellectual project of like a racist retired British gardener. Okay, that's like I'm on a pension, and what I'm going to do is look at the Encyclopedia Britannica and not too much space for the blacks, eh? I'm going to write that up and show that the humans whites accomplished the most. Charles Murray wrote that book. And this gormless motherfucker doesn't take anything from that. In fact, he thinks that he's one of the most oppressed people in America. Which, as Ezra says, is a form of identity politics, which is why I say this with some trepidation, because I still cast a very wary eye on Ezra Klein. But him and the whole Vox crew have been going gangbusters on this. And it is written, I'm sure it's has more currency with a certain type of quantitative normie twerp. Look, at this point, if you want to be part of a decent, polite society, you really don't have any excuse to be defending this guy anymore. I mean, it's been the science at the very least is vastly more complicated. And the fact, by the way, that Harris talked, nobody else, by the way, Flynn does not talk in absolutes. And Turkheimer and Nisbet are clear about Murray and Harris's misreadings and dogmatism. But Harris isn't even from this field, which again, even if we're taking that serious, that this is an indisputed field, Harris is not from it. He's read a couple of books and he's asserting that he's in the right. It's dogmatic, fundamentalist, and bizarre. So Ezra Klein, he's paroled from the pyramid, but still with supervision.
Calling from a 330 area code. Who's this? Where are you calling from?
Hey, Sam. It's Ryan from Ohio.
Ryan from Ohio. What's on your mind?
It's the last day of the semester in the school year, and I wanted to call in and say thank you to you guys for all of your various interviews and musings on the political climate the past the past year or so. I've actually used a lot of the things that you guys have brought up on the show for essays that I had to write for class and stuff.
Well,
and
thank you for listening.
Yeah. And I prepared a list of everybody I wanted to thank. I would like to thank Sam Seder, Michael Brooks, Matt Leck, Jamie Peck, Brendan Finn, Kelly Carey, Matt Binder, Patrick Finn, John Benjamin, Andy Kindler, Dennis Miller, Alex Jones, Mike Cernovich, Mike Cervanich, Donald Trump, Seb Gorka, Paul Ryan, Devin Nunes, Daniel Nunes, Bernie Sanders, Alan Honk Honk Franken, Mark Marin, Judy Gold, Isabel Gillies, Matthew Film Guy, Ronald Reagan, John from San Antonio, Jimmy Dore, that bitch Mike from PA, Dave Rubin, who still won't debate Sam because he's stupid, Janine Garofalo, Bernie Sanders, Jill Stein 2020, Tim Black, Project Veritas, who I happen to really like because they have videos, Matt Taibbi, the Chris Lapaco, the king of earned media, Mindy, Brenda, Jimmy Reefer Cake, Jimmy Reefer Cuck, Joseph Ballin, Rafael Cruz, Right Wing Mandela, Josh from Chicago's mom, Nation of Islam Obama, that guy who said keep it simple and no bumps in the road, but I don't remember his name, Peter Thiel, Greg the Libertarian, H.A. Goodman, Doug, the new dork, and last but certainly not least, Sam, I would like to thank your de minimis penis.
Oh, well, thank you. That was great, Ryan. That is... we got to pull that. Can we make a note?
Brilliant.
We should have that for the end of the year. That is, that's like a best of call just to remind people. Ryan, thank you so much.
And towards the whole
are you graduating?
There.
Are you graduating?
No. Thank you, Sam. No, I'm still a junior, so I guess.
All right. Well, then goodbye. We'll see you next year.
Good luck.
Yeah, see you then.
That was great. Thank you, Ryan.
Okay, this is funny. So, speaking of content creators that I actually respect, I didn't know. So Milo is basically just like the sad sidekick of Alex Jones now. Is that what's going on?
I think he's exploring his opportunities, Michael.
Milo's exploring his opportunities of being a sad sidekick to Alex Jones. And this is footage of this is great. Basically, Milo and Alex Jones they're at like a restaurant or something.
Yeah, it looks like they're eating some food. And
they're eating some food. They're doing a live stream. They're doing a people on the street live stream, and basically, and this is a prodigy for Mobb Deep. They got their start. He caught Q-Tip, a Tribe Called Quest, coming out of I believe it was Def Jam, and he handed him a mixtape. And Mobb Deep was good, and Q-Tip got it, and that's what helped make their career happen. So it's a time-honored tradition of let me show you my tape. A fan of Alex Jones and Milo interrupted the live stream to try to do a prodigy to Q-Tip move.
Have you seen those where they go, "Oh, we're gonna get them"? Like
that's a mark of complacency where you.
Hey, how you doing, sir?
Good. How are you?
Good, man.
Big listener.
God bless you.
By the way, I just want to let you know, I own InfoWarsMusic.com.
That's awesome. Did you see us online? Just come in there.
I saw you on Facebook Live. Yeah, I'm the Spider-Man guy on 6th Street.
Oh, great job, brother.
Have you heard about me?
I have.
Okay, I went into the with Sybil Edmonds protesting the Muslim thing, taxpayer funding of the schools. And I went there with my costume and my Trump shirt in the Capitol. And it's on YouTube.
I saw it's viral. I'm going to scram, but I'm going to get your drink. Boom. I got to go right now.
Hey, I want to set up InfoWarsMusic.com. That's why I moved to Austin, Texas. Can you help me do it?
Rob D. R.
OBD. I've been talking
OBD.
And InfoWars.com. Say it again. ROBD and InfoWars.com.
I ran to some lady. She's like, I met your InfoWars guy.
ROBD at InfoWars.com.
God bless you. We got to split because if the word's out, more people are coming.
You want more funding for your show? Google can't censor a song that sells 1 million copies. And I got 50 artists that already sell their songs on InfoWarsMusic.com to help fund your show.
I'm ready, brother.
You ready?
How
do I contact you?
Rob D. R.D.
At InfoWars.com.
Rob Do. R-Do.
And Rob D. R-Do at InfoWars.com.
Yep, let's go, guys.
I love me. Can I take a picture of yourself?
Let's do it. Let's do it.
Wait, hold on. Yes.
God bless you. No, you're awesome. My security guys, we trust you. Like, get out of there. Get out of there. It's like,
By the way, you know about the RH...
Flamethrowers.
Hey, you know about the RH negative blood types, right? I'm the king of all the RH negative blood types on planet Earth. Sorry.
I love it. All right, God bless you.
One more. I don't think I got it.
God bless you, brother.
R-D-U-A-N-F-O-R.com?
Yes, sir. Rob D.
Rob D. See you later.
God bless you. You don't meet the head of the RH for those times every day.
Yeah.
That is...
Oh, my God.
That's my favorite video, man. Dude.
Man, there's so much going on there.
I can't even... time is dilated, yo. I finally found the one way you get Alex Jones to shut the fuck up, at least temporarily, is just to meet some of his actual fan base.
Oh my God.
And he's got that look like, I love Alex Jones is always giving you perfect like the subtext is, my security's fucking up. Why am I still here? I'm still having to pretend to respect this guy and want to take a selfie. You guys are failing. And then also that moment of like, this guy's actually crazy.
I should go back.
Who, the king of RS negative blood types?
You haven't heard about that?
Spider-Man on 6th Street?
He was the Spider-Man on 6th Street. He was protesting the Muslims.
I have.
Okay, I went into the
I love. Oh, this is the best part. The way he sidles up and pulls the beer in
That is a full beer.
That is so boss.
I don't know if I've seen some full beers in my time. That's the fullest beer I've ever seen.
And he's got, you see, like his head's cocked back, like we're looking to set this meeting up for a while. Glad we finally made it.
That look by
civil
Alex
inmates
Jones.
Protesting the Muslim thing, taxpayer funding of the schools. And I went there with my costume and my Trump shirt in the Capitol.
Down goes the drink.
And the drink.
I saw it. It's viral. I'm going to scram, but I'm going to get your drink.
It's viral.
Boom.
By the way,
I'm gonna get your
they're
drink.
literally in the middle. If we go back to the beginning, they're like having a leisurely conversation. They're mid-drink. And just to throw in there, Milo clearly bummed that this guy doesn't want a selfie with him. Clearly bummed.
Oh, I don't know. I think Milo's like, what is this path I've taken? Like,
well, I think it's a combination. I think it's like, what is this path I've taken? Who is this peasant? But also like, whoa, like I don't get any shine out of this. Like there was a time, like in 2015, Steve Bannon said like I was the most dangerous propagandist on the planet or whatever. And now like I can't even get I was in there with my Trump shirt. We were protesting the Muslims. That guy doesn't even recognize me. But just go back to the beginning to show just how leisurely the pace was. This is what's awesome. All right. So like they're like gotta scram. Just remember that in 30 seconds he goes, gotta scram.
They go, oh, we're going to get him. Like,
But that's a mark of complacency where you.
Hey, how you doing, sir?
Good, how are you?
Good, man.
Big listener.
God bless you.
By the way, I just want to let you know, I own InfoWarsMusic.com.
That's awesome. Did you see us online? Just come in there.
That's awesome. On Facebook Live. Yeah, I'm the Spider-Man guy on 6th Street.
Oh, great job, brother.
Have you heard about me?
I have.
Okay, I went into the with civil inmates protesting the Muslim thing, taxpayer funding of the schools. I went there with my costume.
That is the most Bavarian.
I saw it's viral.
Hey.
I'm going to scram, but I'm going to get your drink. Boom. I got to go right now.
I want to set up InfoWarsMusic.com. That's why I moved to Austin, Texas. Can you help me do it?
Rob D. R.
OBD. And Infowars.com.
Say it again.
ROBD and Infowars.com.
I ran to some lady. She's like, I met your Infowars guy.
ROBD at Infowars.com.
God bless. We got to split this. Get the words out. More people are coming.
You want more funding for your show? Google can't censor a song that sells 1 million copies.
Yes!
I got 50 artists that are ready to sell their songs on InfoWarsMusic.com. Yes! Your show.
I'm ready, brother.
You ready?
Yeah, Rob D. R.D.
At Infowars.com.
Rob Do. R.Do.
He keeps giving him like, he keeps trying to mess up the email address.
RobDo. RobDo.com. RobDo.com.
Yes.
Well, I just want to say to this gentleman, if he's watching, now maybe there's this whole code for anti-globalists that we're not following as globalists in this room, but I think you have to ask yourself after this interaction: is Alex really on your side?
And the second question
Exactly.
you ask yourself is majority FM music available? .com.
Yeah, because I'm not a fucking idiot, okay? I'm not going to turn down, forget majority, TMBS, dude. I'm not turning down an opportunity to make millions, and I would like to hear a lot more about this blood type thing. Wasn't Steve Novella was writing about it in his Skeptics blog?
The only other thing that makes me skeptical is like, if Alex Jones is good enough to make that like seem, natural and organic, like that would be just like king of kings.
RobD, give it to RobDo. The email, as I've said, is RobD at Infowars. Just
Robbie.
We'll figure it out. We're gonna do it, man.
Yeah.
That's what it went.
That was
went
so
viral.
good. God, that was great. I have to say, because I thought when he smacked down the bill, I was like, oh, you're a fucking pro. You're buying the drink and you're out. Like he shot back his drink, slammed down the bill. We're good. And this guy is just like, dude, you're leaving money on the table.
I moved to Austin.
Yeah, I just moved to Austin.
I mean, wow.
I would not be surprised if that guy gets a call from a globalist police force in Austin that he is not allowed within a certain amount of feet. That would be an incredible thing to write. Imagine the play. You just write like a one-man play of like all of the calls and all of the police reports that Alex Jones has filed on fans, like off air. It's like, yeah, some crazy guy is talking about type O blood types or something. I'm going to want a tail on him. That's rich.